Okay, cool. Hey guys, my name's Hannah Chambliss. I'm the hydrologist at Grand Canyon National Park. I am leading the hydrology program at the park, and I've been in this program for almost 5 years now, and it's taken me to some really amazing caves. This is a picture of a cave in Grand Canyon that was actually part of some work for Blaze's project, which he's going to talk about a little bit later. And this photo was taken by Dave Bunnell, which I'm sure most people here know him. He's pretty famous in the NSS world. But if you notice the very technical cave crocs in this photo, it's So I'm going to step away from the 3D modeling talks a little bit and talk about dye tracing and its uses in studying karst groundwater, specifically below the north rim of Grand Canyon. Okay, so just to go over the motivations for the hydrology program at Grand Canyon and some of the laws and policies that direct our work, and then the Grand Canyon specific priorities that guide what research we do in the hydrology program. Just in general, as a government agency, we follow the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So it's just focused on providing safe and clean drinking water to the millions of visitors and residents at the park every year. And then more specifically at Grand Canyon, all of the drinking water is sourced from one single spring below the North Rim called Roaring Springs. And so better understanding that spring and the groundwater system from which it discharges is a really high priority for the park. And so this priority guides the work that we do in better understanding and forecasting the quantity and quality and vulnerability of groundwater resources at Grand Canyon. There's also a pretty massive infrastructure project being undertaken by the park currently called the Trans-Canyon Waterline Project. And it's basically upgrading all of the water delivery infrastructure. The current pipeline that runs through the canyon is about 80 years old now, and it's well past its lifetime. So replacing the pipe as well as diversifying water intake. So as I said, the water is only from one spring right now. And so the park is building some additional water intake from surface water. And so again, we'd like to better inform sustainable water intake strategies and then water source protection for the park's drinking water supply. So better understanding the source of the groundwater system, which is the Kaibab Plateau or the North Rim. And I'll also say that this presentation is as much of talking about dye trace as it is showcasing some really awesome cave photos in Grand Canyon. And this is actually a picture of Blaze in a cave in Grand Canyon. Okay, so everybody, I'm sure, knows where Grand Canyon is. It's in northern Arizona, but the dye trace that I'm going to be talking about is focused on the eastern section of the canyon. And we are studying the groundwater below the Kaibab Plateau. So that's most of the research that the hydrology program at the park focuses on. We work with a lot of collaborators and other agencies who study other groundwater systems in the area, for example, below the Coconino Plateau and in Western Grand Canyon. But much of what we do is studying the water below the Kaibab Plateau. So just a little bit of background on our study area and what the groundwater system below the plateau looks like. It's what's called a stacked karst aquifer system that's part of a much larger regional groundwater system that runs throughout the Colorado Plateau. And when I say stacked karst, the stacked part just means that there's two different aquifers separated by intervening layers, one on top of the other. And karst, just referring to water that's stored in highly dissolvable carbonate rock that creates pretty massive, in this case, cave and conduit systems, as well as sinkholes on the surface. And so in this system, we've got a shallower Coconino or sea aquifer that extends to about 250 meters depth. And then a much deeper Redwall Muav or R aquifer that's between about 700 and 1,000 meters depth. And the two of them are connected mainly by faults and fractures. They're separated by these intervening hermit shale and Supai group layers that are semi-impermeable to impermeable. So the faults and fractures create efficient pathways by which water can travel from the surface and the shallower aquifer to the deeper aquifer. And the primary source of recharge to this groundwater system is from snowpack on the Kaibab Plateau. So winter precipitation occurs, and in the spring, the snow melts and enters the groundwater system relatively quickly. I'll say that one good thing that this cross-section does is show what we know about the system, but what it doesn't do a great job at showing is the complexity of the subsurface. So we don't necessarily always see these beautifully perfect horizontal rock layers, and faults aren't necessarily perfectly straight lines from the surface to the deeper aquifer. And so part of what we like to do for dye tracing is getting at that complexity in groundwater flow in the subsurface. And here's another cool cave photo from a cave in Grand Canyon. This is just to showcase the fact that caves in the R aquifer can be pretty massive, especially in the upper section of the Redwall Formation. Most of the caves in the top section of the Redwall are like matrix-like, massive, have really great cave formations. They're pretty dry. They've got great archaeological and paleontological resources. But most of the springs, let me go back. Most of the springs that are discharging from the R aquifer are coming out of the Muav limestone, where at its base, where it meets the impermeable Bright Angel Shale. And so this is an example of a spring that's coming out of the Muav limestone. So yeah, you can get pretty massive cave spring systems in this groundwater system. Okay, so dye tracing. This is a really exciting and really common tool used in karst hydrogeology to better understand groundwater systems and understand flow paths, and understand, basically how water gets from point A on the surface to point B at springs. It involves injecting fluorescent dye, which is non-toxic and food grade, into a source, whether that be a sinkhole, a sinking stream, another cave spring, and then monitoring springs where that dye could possibly be received. So the photo on the right is actually taken by USGS scientist Kim Beisner, who is heading a dye trace study on the south rim of Grand Canyon. And so they injected dye into a sinking stream there, and I thought this was a pretty awesome photo. So as I said, dye tracing is mainly used to establish groundwater flow paths. In some cases, it can be used to establish flow rates and groundwater residence times. It has not yet been done, that hasn't yet been done at Grand Canyon, but we're hoping to do that with this dye trace project, as well as delineate groundwater recharge or source areas. So understanding that the Kaibab Plateau is a pretty large source area for a really large area of Grand Canyon on the north side. But understanding the specific source areas for specific springs and watersheds is pretty difficult, and it's something that we're hoping to do further with this study. Dye tracing has previously been successful below the Kaibab Plateau at Grand Canyon. This is a photo of Ben Tobin, the previous hydrologist at the park, also a caver, and he led this dye trace from 2015 to 2017. This is a photo of him dumping dye into a sinkhole that's filled with snow on the north rim, and then he'll rebury it with snow, and injecting dye before snow melts allows the dye to get pushed through the system. So you're basically ensuring that a high volume of water is going to make sure that that dye comes out at springs. And the results did reveal, they did get the dye emerging at several springs below the North Rim, but it also revealed flow paths that are more complicated than what was previously thought. They found that the dye and the groundwater didn't always follow major faults. In some cases, the flow paths were estimated to be subparallel to faults. And so could be a case that there are additional faults that we haven't mapped. There definitely are. And then there were also, there was the possibility that there were differences in horizontal and vertical flow paths from each sinkhole. So as you recall, there's the shallower C aquifer, the deeper R aquifer. It's possible that when snowmelt enters the subsurface, it might travel in one direction in the C aquifer, hit a fault, travel down to the R aquifer, and then travel in a different direction. The other possibility is that there could be differences in flow paths based on the type of water source that enters the groundwater. So that would be rain versus snow. So you might get different flow paths based on whether the water entering the system is rain or snow, as well as the timing of when water enters the system. So later or earlier in the spring, when you're thinking about snowmelt. So there's all of these complications. Bring you guys back to our study area. As I mentioned before, the park is looking to diversify its water intake. Currently, the spring that it's pulling water from is here at Roaring Springs, which is in the Bright Angel Creek watershed. Yeah, there's my mouse. And they're looking to pull water from the mouth of Bright Angel Creek. So this is just an outline showing the watershed so we know where we are. Okay, and so this is showing our proposed sinkhole injection sites on the Kaibab Plateau. The circles that are colored peach are our priority 1 injection sites. The other 2 are if for some reason one of these 3 don't work out and we need a backup. And then the gray triangles are showing all of the spring and stream sites that we plan to monitor. And that's about 50 sites. So you can see from this photo that it's a pretty massive area to do a dye trace. We expect water to travel tens of kilometers in just horizontal distance, in addition to the 1,000 meters of vertical distance that the water has to travel. And you can see that since it's such a huge area and we're conducting field work in Grand Canyon, it takes quite a massive field effort to do this work. And then I just wanted to show these arrows are the estimated flow paths that were determined by the previous dye trace. And I said before that the system is not straightforward. It's incredibly complex, and it's almost been considered kind of a black box groundwater system, as a lot of karst hydrology is. And so being able to do as many of these dye traces as possible is really important to better understand what's going on here. But you can see that in some cases, they estimated that dye that was injected in one location traveled in 2 completely different directions. And so being able to understand why that's happening and where that direction change might be happening is important. Okay, so a little bit about the field work that this is going to involve. Here's another awesome photo of a cave spring in Grand Canyon. This involves monitoring about 50 spring and stream sites. And what we'll do to monitor those sites is install these little mesh packets of activated charcoal. And these are really nice and a pretty cheap way to monitor for dye. You basically just attach them to fishing wire and have them submerged in water. And as dye emerges at springs and flows through the system, it can adsorb to the activated charcoal. And so the longer you have that dye packet installed at a spring or stream, the more dye can accumulate in that packet. And so you get a higher chance of actually discovering a hit or finding the dye there. And so we'll have a couple of these at every single site, and we plan to exchange them every 3 to 6 weeks. And so that we try to exchange them as frequently as possible, based on budget and how many people we have available. But the quicker we can exchange them, the better, just because it's a pretty dynamic system and they could get washed away by floods or messed with by humans and wildlife. But also to get a better understanding of the flow rate through the system on a daily scale rather than a weekly scale like you would get with these dye packets, these activated charcoal packets, is installing auto samplers at a couple of our spring sites. So we'll have one of these at Roaring Springs and another one at Vasey's Paradise Springs to the east, in Marble Canyon. And these will take a water sample at the site every day, for 24 days straight. So they've got to be exchanged every 3-ish weeks. But it's a good way at knowing the day that the dye actually emerged at the spring site. So if you know to the day when the dye actually infiltrated the subsurface on the Kaibab Plateau, and you know the day that the dye emerged at springs, and you can kind of see that breakthrough curve of dye, you can get a good handle on that flow rate, which we haven't been able to do before in this system. So it's a goal of ours, kind of a stretch goal, because you can't always control how and when. You can never control how and when snowmelt happens. So it's kind of up to Mother Nature there, but we're going to do our best. So field work is, as I said, a massive undertaking for this project. Here's another cool cave photo of someone really not wanting to get wet, even though he was already wet. It's pretty cold in that cave. So the water in these caves are like anywhere from 3 degrees to 8 degrees Celsius. So pretty cold. These sites will be accessed by helicopter support, backpacking, off-trail hiking, drainage scrambling, and caving. So we've got a team of people really excited about caving and backpacking. So it's kind of the dream. And we've got 50 sites that we have to visit every 3 to 6 weeks. And those site visits are broken up into 6 different trips that happen at that frequency. So that ends up being about 322 total staff days, 600 receptor packets, 300 water samples, and 32 helicopter hours. And this is over a year. So 322 out of 365 days in the year. So at any given day, there's somebody in the field changing out a dye packet. And it's going to be the largest dye trace in North America to date. The first one that happened at Grand Canyon 2015 to 2017 was the largest at that time. But this one's going to be a little bigger. So this is the team that's taking on this work. Myself, the hydrologist, we've got our resident physical scientist, Garrison Loop. He is also a pretty big Arizona caver. And then we've got our hydrology technicians, Zev Axler, Luke Stevens, Shaylin Nelson, Emma Carlson, and Haley Gallett. And Haley is here today, which is why I didn't put a picture of her on here, not because I was unprepared. We also have over 20 volunteers signed up to help with this project. So we've got a lot of help, and we need a lot of help for this field work. So recall what I said before, that dye tracing is used to estimate groundwater flow paths, in some cases flow rates, which is what we're hoping to do. And it can be used to delineate groundwater source areas. But we also want to use this data to integrate with LiDAR-based modeling of our aquifer spring caves that Blaze is doing, and we'll talk about later. We also want to integrate our dye trace results with about a decade of water volume data that we have at springs below the Kaibab Plateau, as well as climate data from the plateau to calculate annual water budgets and forecast groundwater vulnerabilities to climate change. For this semi-arid, high elevation region, like many others, it's expected that temperatures will get warmer, There'll be less winter precipitation, so less snow, and then therefore less groundwater recharge. And so we want to see what the system is doing now and how it will change in response to climate change. And actually, we're seeing snow melt happening about a month earlier on the Kaibab Plateau than the historic average. So we're already seeing some changes. Once we are done with this project, all of our data is going to be archived in our geodatabase, which we're currently in the process of making publicly available. And we'll also publish the results as an article in a professional journal and present it at some professional and public forums, probably GSA in October. There's a biennial conference of science and management at NAU that's hosted every couple years, and maybe NSS in 2025. We'll see. And a lot of this work would not be possible without our nonprofit partner, Grand Canyon Conservancy. They've so far given us $150,000 for this project, and we hope that they give us even more than that. And they probably will. So couldn't do it without them, as well as the NAU Hydrogeology Group, the American Conservation Experience, the Forest Service, the Geoinformatics Group at NAU, and the USGS. And here's another pretty picture of Grand Canyon. And that's it. Any questions?
I got dibs on the first question. Okay. How of all the this is Ray. How of all the thousands of sinkholes on the North Kaibab, how do you pick which ones to put the dye in?
That's a great question. So let me go back to. Okay, so if you notice on this photo, all three of our priority 1 sinkhole sites are on major mapped faults. Those areas also correlate to areas of high sinkhole density, which there were previous modeling studies done that showed these areas of high sinkhole density and high fault density have what's called high karst vulnerability, which just means that they are efficient transmitters of water into the subsurface. So there's that reason. And then along the lines of wanting to delineate source areas for specific springs and watersheds, this black outline here shows an estimated source area for Roaring Spring specifically. So far, this Fuller Canyon sink is actually a repeat injection site from the previous dye trace project. So we're hoping to do that repeated site. The second site over here is a way to provide additional evidence that our delineated source area for Roaring Springs is accurate or not. And then this site up here is near the boundary of the delineated groundwater basin for the Tapeats Deer area. So it's basically just providing evidence for basins that have been delineated by structure, aka faults. And then in order to pick the actual specific sinkhole, so those are just the areas we want to focus on. In order to pick the actual sinkhole, we have to, what we did was looked at, actually Blaze did a lot of this, was looked at the LiDAR of the plateau and looked for sinkholes that were 1, large enough, and 2, had active channels, what looked like active channels entering the sinkhole, but no evidence of water leaving the sinkhole. So we picked out those sites, and then we went to the plateau and visited some of the selected sinkhole sites from the LiDAR, and basically picked sites that didn't have mature vegetation at the bottom, which would suggest that soil was clogging the sinkhole and that water wouldn't be transmitted very quickly. There were a few other parameters that we had for picking an ideal sinkhole, but yeah, that's it.
You're down to 2 minutes, so Steve. And
I got a question.
I just have a quick question. This is Steve Smith. Number one, I'm assuming that the fluorescein is diluted sufficiently that you're not freaking out the tourists.
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
So there's an equation we use to calculate. It's kind of a fine balance, right? Because it has to travel so far that we need to be able to inject a high enough concentration of fluorescein in a solution that it'll show up at springs, but also not too much that it's turning our water source green.
And second question,
So-
well, what's the interval for a re-injection? I guess the question is, is there a kind of a model for, you
Yeah.
allow the system to have flushed out
Mhm.
before you re-inject? Is there kind of a model for that? Is there an estimate?
There's not a specific model, but there is an estimate. So from our spring volume data that we have, there's evidence that that the springs respond to snowmelt really quickly. So we can see as the rising limb happens at springs, increase in discharge, it peaks, it goes back down to base flow. So we can kind of see the snow like flushing through the system. And it happens pretty quickly. It's on kind of sometimes daily to weekly to monthly scale. It's a little bit different from the Coconino Plateau on the south rim. Groundwater flow through that system is a lot slower. The dye trace that was done this year there, they actually just got a couple hits at one spring, and it took about 6 months for the dye to get from the surface to the spring, whereas below the Kaibab Plateau, it can be a few days or a couple weeks. So but our plan is to keep the dye packets out there. And if we get a hit at a packet, exchange it 2 more times. And until we don't get dye detected anymore.
Sounds like we have a
I have a question.
question on the chat.
Yes, it's Gerald Atkinson. I was wondering, are you using a variety of optical brighteners and fluorescein and rhodamine and those sort of things like urinin and all those types of tracers?
We're just using fluorescent dyes. So we're doing uranine, sulfurrhodamine B, and eosine. So no optical brighteners.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I've got a couple questions. One regarding the dye tracing that was done on the south side. Was that, can you tell us where that was done?
Yeah, so actually I can still show it on this figure. So this is the Bright Angel Fault here. And the South Rim village has a wastewater treatment plant that discharges treated effluent into the wash that's created by this fault. And that effluent sinks about 3/4 of a mile downstream of the wastewater plant. So some USGS folks were interested to see if that basically recharge to the groundwater was showing up at springs. So it's about right here. They were sampling for springs below the South Rim for PFAS a couple years ago. They detected some at Monument Spring and Horn Spring. This year they injected dye. Last April they injected dye along this fault. And in around October and November, they got hits at Monument Spring. Granted, those hits were below the lab threshold. They're kind of like plus question mark hits, which means that they were less than 10 times above the background fluorescence. So the USGS scientists are still figuring out how, what they can present there, but it was 2 months in a row they got it. So.
Okay, my second question is, how much farther out is there interest in testing the aquifer? In other words, you're still working at pretty much on the south half of the Kaibab Plateau. There are massive sinkholes all the way up into Utah.
Yeah.
And also on the south side, there's a major sinking stream at the head of Cataract Creek outside of Williams, which you probably know about. You may have even been there with
I
me.
think we've been there, right? Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably when I was there. I'm just wondering if there's plans to extend this testing.
Yeah. So for the Kaibab Plateau and up into Utah, we would like to do some additional injections along this Big Spring fault here. It's really hard to get to those sites in the winter. That's another limiting factor of how we choose these sites. All of our injection sites that we've chosen are accessible. We basically fly over to the North Rim and then use a snowcat and snowshoes to get to our injection sites. So if it's far enough from overland routes, it's really difficult to get to in the winter. And we have to time it with winter snowmelt. You need that snowmelt to push it through the system. So figuring out how to do that, maybe some people do some winter camping up there.